Welcome to the third Hidden Truths series. As I said a minute ago, I'm so gratified to see how many members of our community, both our RW community and more broadly, perhaps our Bristol and our Rhode Island community have made some time tonight to be with us. I'm going to give the briefest of all possible introductions to give the maximum time to Charlotte Carrington-Farmer, who's our third speaker, and for the questions that I'm sure you'll have for her subsequent to her talk. We're going to ask you to use the chat feature in order to pose your questions, and I will be looking over those questions throughout the talk and will pull them together in order to kind of systematize the conversation that we can have in the time that remains after Charlotte's shared with us what she's prepared for tonight. I'm Jason Jacobs. I'm the Associate Dean for General Education, and it's a real pleasure to get to do one of my favorite things, which is something I've been doing a lot over the last several years, which is creating opportunities for people to learn from Charlotte. And I often, when I'm introducing her, fail to resist the temptation to say that though it might sound to you completely absurd and impossible that once upon a time in the UK, a woman was born and raised and educated and wrote an undergraduate thesis on Roger Williams and then did a PhD in New England history, only then somehow to find herself employed as a professor of history at a university named after Roger Williams, which she had literally no reason to know even existed when she began this journey of specializing in New England early modern history. Absurd as that might sound, it is actually the truth. There is such a person, and we couldn't be luckier than to have had her as a member of our community for the past several years. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer is now an associate professor of history, specializing in American history. As I mentioned, she has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, not the same college as Roger Williams. So she strayed from the path a little bit there, but she can be forgiven a certain number of things. The dissertation work that she completed at Cambridge University yielded a biography of Puritan New Englander Thomas Morton, which she has published in a book called Atlantic Lives, Biographies That Cross the Ocean. Has more recently been following a new track in her research that's very interesting and exciting, looking at horses in the early modern Atlantic world and how the breeding and the export of horses from New England to the West Indies and to South America intersected with enslaved lives and with the labor of enslaved peoples. This work has recently been published in an article on the Narragansett Pacer in Rhode Island History, just in 2018, and an exhibition, a wonderful exhibition inspired by this research and by this article, was up at the what's it called? The Arcade in Providence, downtown.
Yeah, the Providence Arcade.
Providence, what's it called, Charlotte?
It's called the Providence Arcade.
Of course it is. There we go. And there's good documentation of that exhibition as well. So more recently, Charlotte has published on Roger Williams and religious liberty, and she's been throughout her time at Roger Williams a really significant player in working on with our Community Partnership Center, working in community engagement. She's been an advocate for students working and doing activism around Indigenous Peoples Day. She has worked to build relationships both inside the university and with our broader community that have led to all the scholarship, excellent teaching, and even study abroad, which I've gotten to participate in myself more than once. So without further ado, because I could go on and on, I'm glad to welcome you all to the third edition of Hidden Truths. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer, take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and it really is my pleasure to work at Roger Williams with such esteemed colleagues. So give me 1 second whilst I share my screen. All right then, so tonight then I'm going to talk to you a little bit, get rid of that, about slavery and the slave trade here in Rhode Island. So I'm going to center then on two things, right? As the title suggests, I'm going to talk about slavery within the colony and later the state, and then also the involvement of the colony and later the state within the transatlantic slave trade. So enslaved peoples lived and labored in Rhode Island from the birth of the colony until slavery was abolished in 1842. And even after 1842, not everyone within the state of Rhode Island got their freedom immediately. New Englanders did not invent chattel slavery, but as Wendy Warren notes, they embraced it. And I'm going to try to paint the fullest picture to you tonight, considering the 17th, 18th and 19th century, and looking at both Indigenous and African enslavement, all in the space of around 45 minutes. So firstly then, I want to do a couple of things with you. I want to share with you this evening as many primary sources as I can with you, and then let those primary documents do the talking. And secondly, just let me press this. Secondly, Marcus Retiker's groundbreaking book, which you see on the screen, which I highly recommend, The Slave Ship, has this subtitle, A Human History. And that's one of the things I want to do tonight. I want to try to make this history of enslavement and the slave trade a human history, and bring to life the lived reality and experiences of those who were enslaved. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I want to give you some resources so you can find out more about all the topics that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And I plan to give you links to websites and reading at the end. So let's start then in the 17th century. In June of 1637, a cargo of around 40 to 50 slaves, 40 to 50 indigenous captive slaves from the Pequot War landed in Providence, Rhode Island. The town of Providence, which had only been founded a year before, was not the planned destination for the captive ship. But once the captain was en route, he decided to dock in Providence on the way to Boston and to march the captives overland. Rhode Island's founder then, Roger Williams, watched closely as the enslaved war captives were shackled and herded into the port of Providence. After inspecting the captains, Williams noticed a young indigenous boy amongst the crowd of mostly women and children, and he decided that he wanted this young boy as a servant/slave. Williams acted quickly, and he literally went home that night and dashed off a letter to the Massachusetts Bay governor, John Winthrop, who again, just a year before had banished him. And he handed the letter directly to one of the colonists who were guarding the Pequot captives. And he told the person guarding the captives to pass this immediately to Governor Winthrop when he and the captains arrived in Boston. Next slide. He handed it to him, and you see the quote from the letter here then. So this is William's letter to Winthrop. I am bold, if I may not offend in it, to request the keeping and bringing up of one of the children. I have fixed mine eye on this little one with red about his neck, but I will not be peremptory in my choices, but will rest in your loving pleasure for him or any, etc. So then we know Winthrop agreed, and a few weeks later, Williams wrote to Winthrop again to thank him. And he said, I'm going to quote to you, he said, "Sir, I desire to be truly thankful for the boy intended. His father was of the place where the last fight was, and fought not with the English, as his mother, who is with you and 2 children more, certified me. I shall endeavour his good and the common good in him. I shall appoint some to fetch him. Only I request that you would please give him a name." So let's take stock then. Just 1 year after the founding of Providence, founded on the principle of religious freedom, Roger Williams owned an enslaved native, one who he was happy to split up from his mother and siblings, and then to completely ask the governor of a neighboring colony to rename him. One of the other things that's slightly unclear is whether Williams had another Indigenous slave. In his later correspondence, Williams refers to, and I quote again, "Will, my Indian servant," and I can talk more in the Q&A about the interchangeability of the term servant and slave in the 17th century as it comes up. So we know then from Williams' correspondence, it reveals how Will, this Indigenous slave, worked as a mediator between Winthrop in Massachusetts, the Narragansett, and also the Connecticut authorities. And one of the questions historians have asked is this the same young boy, the Pequot captive, or is this an older Indigenous man? And it seems most likely, I was at a talk at Smith's Castle just a few weeks ago, and Bob Geek did a great job to kind of hypothesize that it was more than likely another older man, as when Williams sent Will to John Winthrop to help gather information, Williams, in the letter that survives, wrote almost as if Winthrop did not know Will, let alone had potentially named him. And if you want to find out more about Williams and the connection to the Pequot War, there's a really great podcast from NPR, which I'll share at the end in the resources. So more broadly then, Williams looked to the Old Testament and agreed that death was an appropriate punishment for Indians who had English blood on their hands. In the 1630s, Williams also conceded that perpetual slavery would be fully justifiable for the Pequots. But still, he urged some degree of caution. He suggested that perhaps after a certain time of enslavement, what he called, and I'm quoting, training up to labor and restraint, the enslaved Pequots should potentially be set free, but very carefully monitored so they didn't band together and potentially rebel again. And I think one of the things that I really want to hammer home to you tonight is that, like, I think a lot of scholars, well, not a lot of scholars, but perhaps members of the public are like, oh, this is a really good thing for Williams. But I think in reality, this technical distinction between limited term and lifelong slavery was often lost in practice, as we certainly see with later wars. So Indigenous peoples who were enslaved could be handed down in wills, along with estates, animals, and furniture. So Rhode Island colonists, including Roger Williams, held Pequot slaves after the war in the 1630s, really from the get-go of the founding of the colony, without having any clear slave law on the books. So things changed for Williams a little bit after 1676. In the wake of King Philip's War, known Indigenous enemy leaders were simply executed, often quite publicly. One native leader, Chuff, was executed by firing squad in Providence under the watchful eye of Roger Williams after he surrendered on August the 15th. And on August the 23rd, 1676, a special court-martial was held in Newport in which 4 Indigenous peoples were convicted and executed. After the war, Roger Williams signed a document selling Indigenous people into slavery, and this is what you see. The original version from Rhode Island Historical Society is on the screen. And what's more important then, well, not more important, perhaps interesting, is Roger Williams' son, also named Providence. So we have Providence the son and also Providence the town. So Providence the son, and I quote, cleared the town of Providence by his vessel of all the Indians to the great peace and content of the inhabitants, which is to say Roger Williams' son, Providence, helped transport Indigenous men, women, and children as enslaved laborers to work on sugar plantations in Barbados. In Providence, the town, over 30 of the key men involved in the defense of Rhode Island during King Philip's War, including Roger Williams, were rewarded with a share, 3/4 of a share, or half a share of the total proceeds of the sale of the Indigenous peoples. So a really useful resource is what you see on the screen is Linford Fisher's article. And again, I'll include this in the resource list at the end, so no need to scramble to write this down. This article does a good job, though, at looking at the ties of bondage between New England and the West Indies that were so strong already by 1676 that the Assembly in Barbados passed an act to prohibit the importations of Indigenous peoples from New England in the wake of King Philip's War. So what does that actually mean? And what it means is that New England Indians were being shipped to Barbados in significant enough numbers to warrant an entire law in Barbados that specifically targeted them. And Linford Fisher is currently working on a book project and database on Indigenous slavery that I'm certainly eagerly anticipating. So let's stay in the 17th century and turn our attention to African slavery within Rhode Island now. And Roger Williams is actually quite a useful source for this information too. So what you see on the screen then is Roger Williams' book, Akin to the Language of America, that was published in London in 1643. On this left-hand side, you see the front cover, and on the right-hand side, which is what I want to focus on, is page 52. So on here then, you can see that this is it's in the chapter that's talking about Indigenous peoples of their persons and parts of bodies. So you can see then that there are words for, in Narragansett, for hand, for nails, it's got descriptions, it's got the Narragansett word for belly, for toes, a foot, etc. And then it has Narragansett words for skin color, for white, and for black, and also for a coal black man. And it also describes how Williams views Indigenous peoples and race, and also how Indigenous peoples view the enslaved Africans within the colony. And the term that they use is essentially for an African person is in Narragansett is someone who is black, right? This is I pressed the thing. Someone who is black, and then someone here that wears clothes. So I think this is a really interesting primary source. And what it makes clear then is that there were clearly enslaved Africans in New England by the time Williams published Akin to the Language. And I think not only by this point had enslaved peoples been imported, but New Englanders, just like their slave-owning counterparts around the Atlantic world, sought to increase their numbers of enslaved peoples by using sexual assault. And I'm just giving you a warning, the stuff I'm going to talk about next is particularly difficult to listen to. So I want to briefly turn to the neighboring colony of Massachusetts Bay for a minute. So in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in 1638, Samuel Maverick, one of the colonists, owned 2 enslaved African women and 1 enslaved African man. And as you can see on the screen, I'm going to talk about the quotes that you see on the right. As you see on the screen, I quote, "He was desirous to have a breed of Negroes." And I'm using this term and I'm directly quoting from what Maverick said. Thus, he encouraged the enslaved peoples that he owned to have sex. The female slave refused, and I quote again, this is the middle quote you see, "She would not yield by persuasions." What kind of persuasions did Maverick and his male slave try? Maverick at this point refused to let what he described as his breeding plan fail simply because his female slave objected. And accordingly, he ordered his male slave directly to impregnate her by raping her. During the attack, the enslaved woman objected, and I quote, and this is the final quote on the screen, "In a very loud and shrill voice, she objected to the cause of her grief." And put simply then, the cause of her grief was that her owner wanted her raped so he could use her body to increase the number of enslaved people he owned in New England. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that story, I encourage you to check out the book that is on the left, Wendy Warren's New England Bound. And again, that will be in the resources I provide for you at the end. So let's turn back to Rhode Island then. And the importation of African slaves into the colony must have increased slightly by the 1650s, for it gathered the attention of the legislature. In May 1652, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a law stating, and I quote, "that no black mankind or white should be forced into slavery for more than 10 years for adults or until the age of 24 if enslaved prior to the age of 14. The law threatened a £40 fine for those who broke it. And I think scholars then have often cited this law as an early example of anti-slavery legislation. And I guess in some ways it's fair to say it was. You can hear it's coming, but there's a but coming. But this law was also important for who it doesn't mention, Indigenous peoples. The entire law was framed around the buying and selling of black slaves, not Indigenous slaves. The law also contained no obvious remedy for black slaves already in bondage, no mechanism for registration of existing and new slaves, and no real means of enforcement. But it is also a window into how much the culture and practice of enslavement had saturated the New England colonies, including Rhode Island, by the 1650s. And what's interesting is the law of 1652 was not enforced by the end of the 17th century. Thus, by 1696, the first documented slave ship, the Seaflower, docked directly into Newport. And what you can see on the screen then is the Rhode Island 1696 heritage group that uses the date of the arrival of the Seaflower as a way to kind of empower Black history and Black lives in Rhode Island. And again, this will be one of the resources that I'll share with you at the end of my talk. Let's move then and think a little bit more about the 18th century. And to understand both slavery and the slave trade in Rhode Island, you have to understand how closely Rhode Island's economy was tied to the West Indies and South America. Studying colonial Rhode Island in isolation makes no sense, and we need to use what scholars term Atlantic history to situate the colony, and also later the state, within its broader context. As you see on the map then, merchants in Rhode Island transported local agricultural products. Horses, as Dr. Jacobs said, is what I'm interested in, but other things too. Livestock such as cows and sheep and fish, candles, lumber and cheese to the plantations in the West Indies and South America in exchange for molasses. The same merchants then brought molasses back to Rhode Island and sold it to local distilleries who used it to make rum, which was the colonists' staple export. So as you can see on the screen then, this is the Ernst Hampton Bacon mural from the 20th century, from the 1930s. It really captures this economy of Rhode Island in the 18th century. You can see the horses here. The horse here, this chestnut horse that's being handled by this enslaved man here, is a Narragansett pacer, a riding horse. And then this horse here with the heavy feathers and the thicker neck, that's just sturdier, is a draft horse that would be going to crush the sugar cane on the plantation. You can see the cheese, you can see the other animals being raised, etc., etc. So I think this is a really good image that demonstrates Rhode Island's economy in the 18th century. So Christy Clark Pajara estimates that Rhode Islanders trafficked more than 60% of all North American trade in enslaved Africans in the 18th century. Let me just say that figure to you again. Rhode Island trafficked more than 60% of the entire slave trade in North America. That's why that we have to understand this in relation to what's going on within the West Indies. And again, I feel like those statistics don't really hammer home unless we back them up by primary sources. So in 1740, a report to the Board of Trade acknowledged, and I quote from the screen, "The West Indies have likewise reaped great advantage from our trade by being supplied with lumber of all sorts suitable for building houses, sugar works, making casks, beef, pork, flour, and other provisions, where are carried daily to them with horses to turn their mills and vessels for their own use, and our African trade furnishes them with slaves to their plantations." So the Brown family, based in Providence, Rhode Island, shipped horses, many of which were raised by enslaved peoples in Rhode Island, to the Dutch colony of Suriname for draft work. And here you see you see a letter that describes this from 1765. And so you can see here then that this is Nicholas Brown making a purchase agreement with Isaac Tripp, and he's asking him to buy for him 40 horses that are in good case fit for the Suriname market. And he proposes then that he's going to pay for them in rum, sugar, molasses, and this is a key piece here, one Negro girl. So we can see from this letter then that Rhode Islanders directly traded their human and non-human animal property, often one and the same. And the Browns were not alone, and countless Rhode Island merchants were deeply connected to the West Indies trade. Commonly, Rhode Islanders distilled and sold rum and had financial interests in large sugar plantations in the West Indies. From Bristol, the DeWolf family fortune was built in part on buying and selling enslaved human beings. And over the course of 50 years and 3 generations, from 1769 through to the 1820s, the DeWolfs were the nation's leading slave traders. Again, the nation's leading slave traders come from Bristol, Rhode Island. Let that sink in. They brought approximately 10,000 Africans from the coast of West Africa, not all directly into Bristol, I want to be clear about that, but to other places too, into Charleston, South Carolina, other southern US ports, to Havana, Cuba, and other ports in the Caribbean, and some to their own sugar plantations in Cuba, and then some into their own homes here in Bristol, Rhode Island. So their trade network was very widespread. The family continued this trade despite state and federal laws prohibiting many of their activities as the 18th century progressed. Whilst the DeWolfs centered their plantation activity in Cuba, Abraham Redwood of Newport inherited a large sugar plantation in Antigua, and he owned around 200 enslaved peoples. And again, I often think hearing numbers like that just seemed really far away and really abstract. Who were those people? What can we learn about them? And documents pertaining to the plantation are housed in the Newport Historical Society. And I think they not only bring home Rhode Island's connection to the West Indies, not only bring home Rhode Island's connection to the West Indies, but the horrors of plantation slavery and Rhode Island's involvement in that too. So you can see here then, I was lucky enough, I have a New England Regional Consortium Fellowship Award for this year, and I was lucky enough to actually get into the archives this summer at Newport Historical Society in a safe, socially distanced way. And I was ploughing through these plantation records looking for references to horses. So I was interested in this because it was listing the horses and the mules and the other animals that Redwood had on his plantation in Antigua. But one of the things, again, that always strikes me is how enslaved people and animals are just often listed next to each other. And here, like, you can see the young children, right? Like there's 10 young kids at the breast. There's some that are described as distempered. The bit of this letter that I'm actually really interested in is this bit at the bottom that's ripped and missing that's talking about mules. But again, I can talk more about that in the Q&A. So who are these people, right? They're just a number here. What else can we learn from the archives? Well, it turns out that the the records in Newport Historical Society were really quite fruitful. So what you can see here then is a list then of, you can see my notes as I was writing this, is the list of expenses connected to the plantation that Abraham Redwood, as he was living in Newport, incurred. So you can see all the plantation costs and the price here. And let me just zoom in here. So one of the things that struck me is that, again, I'm interested in the relationship between enslaved peoples and animals. And one of the expenses that Redwood had was the cost of 4 collars. And again, I'm quoting, for the Negroes. And again, this is listed to, like, listed next to all the kind of harnesses and collars that the horses, oxen, and mules would have to wear. So that really struck me as I was plowing through the archives this summer. Sorry, I'm jumping around. We can also have a look then at other types of primary sources. One of the things that I really was interested in was when enslaved peoples died in the plantation. And this, again, it was in the archives this summer. You can see then it's a list of enslaved peoples who had died on the plantation. And it lists, let me just zoom in a little bit. It lists basically when they died, their name, what they died of, and how old they are. All right, so it's very formulaic in how it's done, and you'll see on the next slide in a minute like how many people died. But there were a few things that really struck me, right? So here we are then, like Boyston died, right, of the drowsy, right? He was about 50 years old. And it says, and this is the and sign, and he was good for nothing. And this is again like how Rhode Islanders describe their enslaved property when they die. And you see this term multiple times in the death records, right? Good for nothing, right? And then you see like the young kids dying, right? You know, Charlot died of a fever. He was around 7. So I think it's not just, I think it's one thing to say, you know, Abraham Redwood, who lived in Newport, had around 200 slaves in Antigua. And then I think this really brings it to light. And this was one of perhaps the most difficult documents to read. Again, it's the list of enslaved peoples on the estate of Abraham Redwood that had died. And I just want to kind of zoom in here a little bit. So you can see then that this is just from the period from May 1758 through to the following June, so within 1 year. And again then, one of the things that really struck me is when young children dies, right? So like little Margaret, an infant, had died. And 2 more things. We see this constant reference to enslaved peoples eating dirt. And we also see that phrase again, enslaved peoples had been good for nothing. So here then we can see here, right, Jono had died of a pleurisy. His body was burnt for eating dirt. He was 26 years old. We see here then a body burnt for eating dirt. Here we are, Lincoln, a new Negro, never did any work, right, since he was got, age 28. Here we are, body burnt for eating dirt, same here, right? Here we are, Lambert, a Negro woman, a constant runaway, her body burnt for eating dirt. Here we are, a dirt eater, body burnt. We see the term again, right? You know, a dirt eater. Here we are, this person doesn't even get a name, burnt a dirt eater, age 30. The same here, right? Like a new Negro, good for nothing. And then here, right, another good for nothing enslaved person who died at 27. And I think, again, like reading these records really does kind of hammer this home. And I was really curious about the dirt eating stuff, right? So I did a little bit more digging in the archives, and what you can see is on the screen is correspondence between Abraham Redwood, who was based in Newport, and his plantation manager. And I'm going to zoom into this letter. You can see some bits of it are missing, but this is a bit that really struck me about the dirt eating, right? I want to start here, right? So we got in May last 6 seasoned slaves, and then put them, it says here, to work on the sugar plant on your plantation, and hope we have better luck for the future. But the Negroes throughout the island, and yours particularly, are so given to, and then this word we guess is eating dirt, that the numbers, you know, must perish by it. For no matter we have tried, for no matter, you know, we have tried to break them of it, right? Nothing's worked. So they're doing everything they can to stop their enslaved peoples eating dirt. And again, this idea of enslaved peoples eating dirt, like, why are they doing it? Are they hungry? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a form of resistance? And there are multiple hypotheses out there. But again, I think that these documents really do bring this home for me. And I think, so I think it's worth remembering when you're here at the Redwood Library in Newport, you know, which is the oldest extant library in America, that it was underwritten and funded from money gained from the practices that I just described to you. So I think every aspect of Rhode Island life in this period is somehow connected to slavery and the slave trade. So I think in addition to trading in slaves and owning slaves in the West Indies, Rhode Islanders owned enslaved peoples here in Rhode Island. And enslaved people in Rhode Island labored in what Christy Clark Pajara terms the business of slavery. And by 1750, Rhode Islanders held the highest proportion of enslaved people in New England. 10% of the total population was enslaved, which was actually double the northern average. In 1720, there were 543 estimated enslaved peoples in Rhode Island, and by 1750, 3,347. So maps are also a useful primary source for us to consider. And I think this one helps us understand Rhode Island in the late 18th century. So let's just orientate ourselves then. Bristol is down here, right? Like here's Mount Hope. The bit of Rhode Island I want to focus on, here's Providence up here. Newport is down here. I want to focus on the left-hand side on the West Bay in an area that I'm going to refer to as South County. So North and South Kingston, I'm going to be talking about, like Wickford. That area is what I want to talk to you a little bit about next. So we can see then, sorry, I forgot I got this zoomed in. Here's the island of Rhode Island, of Quidnick Island. This is the bit I want to talk to you about, South County. So census data is also really useful to historians seeking to understand enslaved life. You can see here some clear examples, and I'm not going to kind of make you squint and try to read this. I've typed some of this up for you. So we can hone in through the census in certain areas through the census data, as you can see here from the example of 1730. Enslaved peoples were heavily concentrated in the port cities of Newport, Providence, and Narragansett country, that piece on the left of South County. Historian Ira Berlin famously differentiated a slave society from a society with slaves. In a slave society, enslaved labor, sorry, let me get my words right. In a slave society, enslaved labor was essential to the economy, and slaveholders constituted the ruling class. In contrast, in a society with slaves, enslaved labor was marginal to the overall economy, and slaveholders were part of but did not dominate the elite class. And what I want to make clear to you is this area of South County was 100% a slave society within the wider area of New England that was a society with slaves. So it was a full-on slave society, certainly in South County. In South County, enslaved labor was central to the economy and societal hierarchy, and slaveholders dominated the ruling class. There's been some debate in the historiography about where South County plantations got their enslaved people. And I think one way to help make sense of this is to think chronologically and to assess how things changed during the course of the 18th century. What you see on the screen then is a quote. So this is from Governor Cranston in 1708, and I'm going to read the quote to you. "We have inspected into the books of Her Majesty's custom that from the 24th of June, 1698 to the 25th of December, 1707, we've not had any Negroes imported into this colony from the coast of Africa. The whole and only supply of Negroes to this colony is from the island of Barbados, from whence is imported 1 year with another, betwixt 20 and 30. And if those arrive well and sound, the general price is from 30 to 40 pounds per head. We have advised with the chiefest of our planters and find there would not be disposed in this colony above 20 or 30 at the most annually. The reasons of which are chiefly to be attributed to the general dislike of our planters have for them, by reason of their turbulent and unruly tempers. And that most of our planters that are able and willing to purchase any of them are supplied by the offspring of those they already have." And again, think back to that early 17th century breeding experiment with Maverick, which increased daily. And that inclination of our people in general is to employ white servants before Negroes. Some suggest that a few Narragansett planters, such as Roland Robinson Jr., Thomas Hazard, imported enslaved peoples directly into their landings on Boston Neck. However, Newport was the key slave market within New England, and then Providence too. When Newport merchant Thomas Richardson wrote to his friend John Mumford in 1739, he described a recently arrived cargo of enslaved people. He said, "Hello, friend John Mumford. Here are sundry new Negroes in town to be sold, both girls and boys from 10 to 12 to 16 to 18 years of age, whose prices are from 80 pounds to 110 apiece. And newspaper adverts for recently arrived enslaved peoples also give us an insight into life in Rhode Island. You can see an example here from the Newport Mercury from 1763. And again, we'll just take the time to read this source. On Thursday last arrived from the coast of Africa, the brig Royal Charlotte, with a parcel of extremely fine, healthy, and well-limbed Gold Coast slaves. Men, women, boys, and girls, gentlemen in town and country have now an opportunity to furnish themselves with such as will suit. Those that want are desired to apply very speedily, or they will lose the advantage of supplying themselves. They are to be seen on board the vessel at Taylor's Wharf. And it says, note, those that remain on hand will be shipped off very soon. And it tells you who to apply to. As you see from the portrait then, Rhode Islanders kept slaves in a range of professions. So John Potter from South Kingston had enslaved peoples fulfilling a range of roles, ranging from raising animals to, as you see, being house slaves and serving tea, as you see on the image here. We know that most enslaved people were trained in a particular trade within Rhode Island and often lived within the house. Just give me 1 second. I just had to let my dog out, my apologies. Here we are, talks in the time of Zoom. We know then that most enslaved peoples lived within the house, perhaps in the attic or barn. Few planters had separate quarters for enslaved peoples, which meant that they were often under constant scrutiny. However, historians have worked with archaeologists to kind of rethink some of this, and there were certainly some plantations, on some of the larger plantations, that were separate areas for enslaved peoples in some of the larger estates. And there's debate on how many enslaved peoples individual families and farms had in South County. Estate inventories and probate records are a great source for this. Some suggest then that the numbers really did vary, perhaps 40 to 60, some say an average of 20, some say some planters had close to 50 enslaved people, some had 5 or so. So, for example, what we do know is that the Stanton family had 40 enslaved people. Roland Robinson had around 28 or more at one point. His father, who was the deputy governor, had 19. I think part of this confusion is record keeping and confusion over terms. Besides enslaved Africans, planters employed indigenous peoples, indentured servants, so there was a spectrum of unfreedom. So going back to the mural then, we can see then that when Ernest Hamilton Baker sketched this mural, he did not include any indigenous peoples in the final version. This is housed at South County History Center, and I was lucky enough to spend some time there looking through some of the original sketches. You can see here then that in some of the sketches he had planned to include indigenous people here on the left, and then also in the sketch here and also here. And so this is one of the things that's really interesting to me, to think about what happens in the 18th century. And there's a really great article that, again, I'm going to recommend to you in the resources, that talks about how enslavement and cultural genocide, basically, and documentary genocide go hand in hand, and how indigenous peoples were often incorrectly identified in the records as being Black. And so we see this kind of blurring of boundaries in the 18th century. Again, this is on the resources that I'm going to recommend to you. There are some really interesting and tactile ways to learn about 18th century enslaved life. One of the things you can actually do is to go and visit some of the surviving plantations. Smith's Castle, again in South County, is a really good example. And the site also has connections to Roger Williams, because that was his trading post. It then went to Richard Smith, Jr., who was one of the first planters in the region. And when he bequeathed Cocoa-Scuttett to his nephew, Lodowick Updike, the Updike family developed the plantation into a huge, large-scale plantation that encompassed around 3,000 acres at its peak. And one of the things that you can do is when you go to Smith's Castle, you can see on the wall inside an inventory displaying the slaves and the livestock. They also recently installed a slave medallion marker there. So again, you can visit these places as you are out and about. I'm mindful of the time, so I've got just a few more points to make. We know that people of color who were enslaved refused to be treated as objects or property. Understanding resistance from the enslaved and their lived experience shows how slavery was contested at every step. Enslaved people in Rhode Island, just like their counterparts throughout the early modern Atlantic world, ran away, lobbied for their freedom, worked to live full lives within the constraints of slavery. And I think runaway adverts, again, are a really useful primary source. And we can see then, I'm going to come back to that. We can see here then some of the adverts for enslaved people and some of the jobs that they did. These people are farmers, but I want to come to these runaway adverts here, right? So runaway from the subscriber at South Kingston in the colony of Rhode Island. It describes the young Negro man named Demas. It tells you how tall he is. He has a down look, is thin-jawed, he's got a visible scar from the bridge of his nose over his cheek, reaching beyond the corner of his mouth. I wonder how he got that. And adverts for runaway slave really do describe in great detail what he was wearing, and basically saying that he's hoping that he might effect his escape to Boston. And there's a reward here, and Lodowick Updike is one of the updikes that ran Smith's Castle, that ran that as a plantation. We can see other examples. This is from Warren, right? So we see here then run away from the 10th of this instance in December, from Nathan Miller of Warren, a shipwright, an enslaved man named Dick. Again, we have this really good description of him. He too has a scar on one side of his face, and many of these show scarring. You can see the description of what he was wearing, and again, the reward that is offered for him. All right, so we can learn also a little bit about the individual enslaved people who lived in Rhode Island. The Reverend Dr. MacSparren mentions Emblo, Hannibal, Harry, Jane, Mole, Philip, Stepney, and Stepney II. MacSparren was involved in missionary efforts amongst enslaved workers in Rhode Island from 1720 onwards. Writing in 1741, MacSparren noted, and I quote, you can see this is the first one on the screen, he spends 1 hour immediately preceding divine service in instructing these poor wretches, who for the most part are extremely ignorant, and whether from the novelty of the thing or, as he hoped, from a better motive, more than 50 slaves give their attendance. MacSparren's farm, on MacSparren's farm, enslaved men worked hoeing, walling, ditching, fencing, mowing, haying, milking. And MacSparren records the work that one slave, Harry, did. And this is a middle quote you see on the screen. Harry hilling corn, my Negro digging potatoes. Harry split 120 steaks. Harry salted meat. Harry carted the hog, and then he and Emblo brought the corn and stalks from Boston Neck. So we know that enslaved people on the plantations face physical punishment and the psychological threat of sale. Chronic runaways were branded. And we know then that enslaved peoples were constantly watched from masters' homes, and few of the farms were large enough to kind of have them far away. And MacSparren then, you can see this is the final quote on here, I got up early this morning and finding Hannibal had been out, I stripped and gave him a few lashes till he begged. As Harry was untying him, my poor passionate dear, his wife, saying I had not given him enough, gave him a lash or two, upon which he ran. And a few days later, Hannibal was whipped again, after which he ran away. And it was at this point one of MacSparren's parishioners begged MacSparren to be more lenient with his slave. And whether he did is another matter. So again, one of the things that comes up is like, well, enslavement wasn't that bad here in the North. I would ask you to consider this particular story as we push back on that. So final point then. So I want to think about enslaved people and agency. So despite the horrors, enslaved peoples built lives. One example is the so-called annual election, which took place in each town in Narragansett country and was held annually in June throughout the 18th century. It was, and I quote, an imitation of the white, and the enslaved peoples assumed the relative rank of their masters. It reflected poorly on owners if their enslaved people were poorly clothed or mounted on substandard horses. Therefore, enslaved peoples, and I quote, mounted on the best Narragansett pacers pranced to the election, then feast, danced, and played games. Whilst the exact nature of the elections unclear, it's evident then that enslaved people were using this as a way to celebrate the life they have. And I know historians have written at length on this, and again, I can point you to this. So whilst the American Revolution initiated the end of slavery in the North, the process was slow and uneven. In February 1784, the Rhode Island legislature passed a compromise measure for gradual emancipation of slaves within the state. For African Americans in Rhode Island, freedom came in stages: slave flight, military service, private manumissions, gradual emancipation laws that slowly dismantled Northern slavery. But to conclude, I want to end with the story of James Howland. When James Howland died in 1859, he was 100 years old and lived as a slave in Rhode Island nearly all of his life. The Rhode Island General Assembly waited until there were just a few enslaved peoples left in the state to abolish the institution of slavery in 1842. So I think, again, we see that this is 1859, right? So we've been able to go right from 1638 right through to 1859 and trace the story of enslavement in Rhode Island. I'm happy to pause now and to take some questions. I have resources that I can share with you, but for now I'll stop and say thank you for listening. I'll stop my screen share.
Thanks so much for that. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions. So let me just have a peek and see if we can distill some questions. One that's come up right away from Courtney Garrity. I'll just read the question. In looking at the 1730 census and how there were high numbers of African slaves in port cities, it is interesting to see how there were towns such as Westerly, whose indigenous slave count was 5 times greater than that of their African slaves. And do you believe this is based on proximity to local tribes or outer bands from Metacom's war, or do you believe the number may be skewed from document genocide?
Yeah, Courtney is a fabulous student, and it's no surprise to me that she asked that really wonderful question. Yeah, right, like that is a really, really good question. I think part of that is based on the tribes that were in that area, particularly post 1670s after King Philip's War. But exactly as you're right, Courtney, you read the article, The Narragansett, A Right to a Name. Like, I think so much of this is perhaps documentary genocide. And again, like that whole West Bay of South County, the plantations there with the farms, I think that's what skews those numbers, right? We see it in port cities where there's trade and stuff like that, but we see like those higher numbers where the farms are, and Westerly is right on the cusp of that. So yeah, really great question.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from our provost, Margaret Everett, that's wanting some context on the burning of slaves attributed to eating dirt. And did slaveholders mean that literally? Was it a reference to hunger, or was that phrase used to demean and dehumanize?
Yeah, I think that it's both of those, Provost Everett, right? I think at times when slave owners are writing about it, they are literally seeing their slaves crawling around eating dirt. Like, there are some of the letters that I found that describe that, and I think they realized that that is a protest to hunger, right? Like, one of the things that I've been really interested in is looking at enslaved people's diets, and again how it pertains to my research on horses, that as a form of sabotage and protest in the West Indies, enslaved peoples will just kill the horses that are meant to be crushing the sugar because they wouldn't get any meat in their diet unless the horse died. So I think it's that, but I think also you can read the brutal language, right? Like in those death records, it is in fact also a way that slave owners and plantation owners used to dehumanize them. So yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I've also heard about clay eating, right? Clay eating is a feature in the South.
Yeah.
This kind of long history of apparently traced back to Africa, and it's a nutrient-rich food source that
It is too, and right, like this is what some of the historiography is talking about, right? How much of this is cultural? Like, can we trace? I mean, the case study I was giving you is from Antigua, where these enslaved people would have come from, and whether this is also a cultural thing that then took on a moment of resistance too, right? So I think it's really multi-layered too.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to condense questions. Our current student, Spencer Wright, whom I'm about to have a meeting with later this week, hi Spencer, is curious about where this direction is going, but I wonder if we could enhance that question with one posed by Miles Ferroli, who is an alum, hi Miles, about the way in which what you're finding in the archive could actually be leveraged in the interest of anti-racist and anti-white supremacist work today. There's sort of two different ways of thinking about the use of what you're finding in archives.
Yeah, that's huge. So I have the pleasure of currently teaching Spencer, and I had the pleasure of teaching Miles when Miles was a student, and Miles actually took my Slavery in the Americas class like many years ago. So it's really great to hear those questions. Yeah, I think you're right. I see my research building on some of the work that's going. I'm going to actually just screen share again to answer some of these questions, because I think, as Miles says, these are some of the like local history projects that are going on, but the one that I'm particularly interested in, oh, I didn't put it on here. Sorry, wrong slides. I won't try and look for them. But one of the things that I'm really interested in, there's a big push from the International Museum of the Horse to look at Black Americans within the horse industry and to kind of center their voices. And so I see my work really strongly fitting in with that kind of work too. And again, thinking about how we can talk about agency, right? Like it was enslaved Indigenous peoples and African peoples who were raising these horses, were breeding these horses, that would have been involved in the training of these horses, right? Like trying to think about like what that job looked like, and to tie it into stories of agency and empowerment. So yeah, and Spencer's question about where is my work going? I mean, hopefully post-COVID, I'll have time to get into the archives in Barbados and Jamaica, and I'm interested in looking at mules as well now.
And if you learn Dutch, you can go to Suriname.
Exactly, right? I mean, well, that's why you and I are friends. You're going to help me out with that.
Let me condense another two questions that I think are really interesting together. They both speak to the question of, the role that memory plays and what kind, how, the representation of the past or the carrying forward of tradition, marks our political allegiances one way or the other. Donna Saloni asked a question about the change to the official name of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that difficult question around how, what is a plantation in the long history that we're talking about here. But I'd like to kind of bring that together with a question posed by Marisa Cestone. Of course, I want to pronounce these all in good Italian, who just poses the question of like, is there room to honor the memory of the DeWolfs or of Roger Williams or of these people who were complicit in the enslavement of Native and African peoples, or do we need to turn our backs in some sense, in order to put ourselves in a different place relative to those histories?
I think that's a really good question, and it's something that I've been grappling with both personally and also in the classroom, certainly since this summer. I think that the way historians are trying to make sense of this is to kind of really show nuance, right? To think about people who are huge proactive slave traders who make all of their money, are 100% invested in that, and differentiate them from people like Roger Williams. And again, as you know, I am not part of someone who advocates for great white man theory. I do not do hero worship, but I think as a historian, we have to show that nuance, right? Like Roger, who for most of his life did his best within the constraints of how he saw the world to deal equitably with indigenous peoples who did take on indigenous slaves in the wake of war, right, personally, and also to profit from them, versus someone whose primary job is to be like the #1 transatlantic slave trader, like the De Wolves in North America in the 18th century. So I think we have to appreciate those nuances. I think we see that with other questions about Confederate monuments too, right? Like the debate about like Washington Lee University, like should we get rid of both names? Like what should we do? And the debate in England about the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. I think we have to understand that nuance. But I will also say that we have to stand up to these difficult questions, right? Like as Roger Williams University, as you're the Dean of Gen Ed, all incoming freshmen learn about Roger Williams, and they learn these uncomfortable truths about his role in the slave trade and enslavement too. So I think we have a job to tell these stories. I think that's the key point, that we can't shy away from them. And then we make like nuanced decisions on who we continue to celebrate in light of that.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you just one more question, Charlotte, if you would. Not passing over, but condensing together many comments that extend, gratitude and praise for the work that you've shared with us tonight. I'm interested in this question that Thomas Irvine poses about the difference between the documentary record for enslaved indigenous Americans versus the documentary record. Is it the case that there is a relatively greater wealth of primary sources for enslaved Africans in New England? And if that is the case, is there some kind of explanation that you could advance for why that would be?
Yeah, that's such a good thing, right? Like I always, when I'm teaching both Indigenous history and also Black American history, when we're looking at this, not just enslaved people, but free people of color within the colonies and later the state, I think the lack of resources is astounding, right? I point you back to the Narragansett, A Right to a Name documentary Genocide, who it's not just simply a case of saying, oh, we have more resources on one group versus the other. It's more complicated than that, because the written resources just categorize everyone as being not white, basically. And we see that increase during the course of the 18th century. So it's not just that we have more or less resources, it's that the written records, like the white colonists and settlers, just don't care, right, to show that nuance. So, and there's some really interesting cases, right, from the Narragansett country, where you can see the same people are categorized initially as being indigenous, and then like 3 years later in the record, they're categorized as Black. And so you can see that documentary Genocide. And so I think we have to understand that when we're thinking about what the resources show too.
Yeah.
And like the issues of the connection too, right? Like there's been recent work with local indigenous communities to reconnect with New England indigenous people who were enslaved in the 17th century and sent to Bermuda and to Barbados, and to kind of reconnect with those ancestors and learn those different oral history too. So we're always getting new sources.
Thank you. I think that I'll give myself the last word on this, just to mark that this talk is such a good example of what we have been aiming for in this whole series, which is to talk about the ways in which the history, despite the lacunae, despite the holes, the missing pieces, the history that we're talking about is actually all around us. And everywhere we look in Rhode Island, there are histories of enslavement and of resistance to enslavement, as you've detailed for us so richly. So thanks, Professor Carrington-Farmer, and thanks to all of those of you who joined us. Attendance was really wonderful for this event. We had a whole lot of us here, and we couldn't be more pleased and prouder than to have these kinds of conversations happening at and through our university and in this community that we know benefits from having the opportunity to think about the hard stuff together.
And can I just say, I have a bunch of resources that I'm happy to share with people. So if people want to look me up, send me an email. Like I have a whole list of books and websites of community engaged work on this. So please don't reach out to me. I really want this to be transparent and for people to continue to learn. This isn't a one-off event, and we all have more work to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, thanks very much. Have a good night, everyone.